Thank you very much, Hiba, and thank you all for coming. It's such a pleasure to be at Villanova, partly because I was an undergraduate at Duke, and here we can sort of have some solidarity now that we're out of the tournament. We can turn back to real business. One thing I will say is no thank you to the Pennsylvania weather, trying to catch me up on all this snow that I missed all year. You know, Oxford has had a very mild winter, and in the 36 hours that I've been in this country so far, we've already seen more snow than I had seen in England for an entire season. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted to speak about Indonesia and to talk about Indonesia's Islamic Revolution, because I think that this is something that's understudied. I think it's something that's important, and I think it's important not just for Indonesia, but also for the wider Islamic world and for the world in general. But one of the things that I like to do, because Indonesia is so understudied, is to start off with a little quiz. How much folks know about Indonesia's size? So I want you to imagine in your head that on one side of this scale, we've got the Muslim population of Indonesia just in 2010. And I use 2010 because that's the most recent census. And I'm going to list off some countries for you from the Arab world. And think of them in terms of cumulative population, right? Not one-on-one, but add up everything on the other side of the scale. And when you think that the population is about equal on both sides, just throw up a hand. And I'm going to go through all of them. So by the end, everyone should have your hands up. I promise by the last country that you will have, passed equilibrium. But when you think we passed that, just throw up your hand. So we'll start off with Saudi Arabia, then add Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, now we're back to some big countries, Syria, Lebanon, yeah, we got one, Jordan, Palestinian territories, we're adding a couple more people, yeah, Egypt, yep, a lot of hands up, add Libya, Algeria, and then Morocco. Okay, so everyone should have hit that point in their head somewhere. The Muslim population only, in 2010 was equal to everything up to halfway through Algeria. And that's the entire population of those other countries. So that includes an awful lot of Copts in Egypt, it includes Maronites in Lebanon. That is a huge Muslim population. So we need to remember that not only is Indonesia the most populous Muslim country in the world, but that its Muslim population is larger than most of the Arab world combined. So that's one of the reasons why I think that this is very important. To give you an idea of Indonesia, this is a map of the archipelago, and if you stretched it from tip to tip, this far northwest corner in Aceh, down to the tip of Papua here in Merauke, would be further than from Los Angeles to Augusta, Maine, or from about London to Moscow. And I've shaded it here by the data from the 2010 census on the percentage of Muslims in each province. And this is not by straight quintiles. Note that that darkest black color is for those provinces that have above 95% Muslim population. But Indonesia as a whole today is about 88% Muslim. And that was probably the figure in the 1940s, which is the period that I'll talk about. The era that I think is so fascinating in Indonesia's history starts off with the Indonesian Revolution and then moves forward through the 1950s. But I want to start off by setting the scene a little bit with Indonesia's colonial history. Indonesia was a Dutch colony that was cobbled together from a great diversity of local kingdoms and local principalities across the archipelago that you see here. The country today was sort of finalized in its borders in 1911, the same year that a major Islamic organization called the Syarikat Islam launched nationalism in Indonesia through its efforts at building mutual assistance and at building political consciousness among the Muslim population. As nationalism grew and interacted with other major ideologies, including communism, socialism, but also Islamic modernism, also the idea of secularism, which was very new for Indonesia. More and more inhabitants of what was then the Dutch East Indies began to think of themselves as one national collective, and they came up with the name Indonesia in 1942. Now that national space, in 1928, that national space was conquered in 1942 by the Japanese, who swept down during the Pacific War, or the Second World War, and took over the Dutch colonial territories. Within 2 months, this entire area fell. Shortly after the Japanese surrender in 1945, in fact 3 days after the Japanese surrender, Indonesia proclaimed its independence on August 17th. What followed from August of 1945 until December of 1949 was called the Indonesian Revolution. In Indonesian, they say Revolusi Indonesia Merdeka, so the revolution for Indonesia's independence. And the basic dynamic was between the Dutch, who were intent on recolonizing their old sort of crown jewel or their old cash cow, and between the Indonesians. And this nascent Republic of Indonesia was a state that was based on Java. Java is this long island along the bottom here. And it's by far the most populous island. It has about 60% of Indonesia's population today. But this encompassed all of the former Dutch colony. Robert Cribb, my colleague at the Australian National University, has said that the revolution was, quote, a long fractious ceasefire punctuated by brief bouts of heavy fighting. And it's true that most of the Indonesian independence was actually achieved not on the battlefield, but was achieved through diplomacy and through slow negotiations. One of the interesting things about the Indonesian Revolution, it's the first time that the United Nations was called in to settle a dispute between theoretically sovereign countries, to settle a anti-colonial or post-colonial dispute. But the experience in Indonesia was not one of diplomacy, was not one of long negotiations. The experience for the vast majority of the Indonesian population was of a popular uprising. It was focused on the experience of Indonesians as they tried to fight off this reinvading colonial power and simultaneously tried to set up their new state. And that's what I'll talk about today. Now, the concepts that Indonesians held during this revolution vary on at least three axes, if you'll sort of accept that concept in your mind. One is time, that the revolution meant something different at the beginning in August of 1945 than it did at the end in December 1949. Their understandings evolved. The other one is space. So at the capital, which was first Jakarta and then in Yogyakarta, they had ideas about the revolution that were tied to the diplomacy. Out in villages, and especially as you got further away from the capital, there was less of an idea connected to diplomacy. But across both time and geography, there's a third axis. So imagine this is the z-axis, sort of striking through towards y'all. That's ideology. And this ranges from Marxists or communists on the left through some non-Muslims, some mild socialists, non-pious Muslims, so those who aren't practicing, and then to pious Muslims, what you see on the far right. Pious Muslims are those who would engage in their 5 prayers every day, those who would abstain from pork, those who might fast during the month of Ramadan or might eventually go on the Hajj. And that's the understanding that I want to focus on today. I think it's important to understand the revolution from the pious Muslim end of the spectrum, not just because this was a large portion of the revolution, but also it's the part of the revolution that was most contested and has some very important lessons moving forward. So based on my study, I want to sort of lay out a couple of lessons for us, and I'll organize it in this way. I believe that the Indonesian Revolution was an Islamic revolution, both at the grassroots level, where individuals thought that they were participating in a fight for an Islamic state, and at the elite level in a different way. At the elite level, there were transformations that were revolutionary for the future of Islam in Indonesia, and that institutional legacy is worth discussing. So the big lesson from this Islamic revolution is that even political revolutions that appear to be secular at their elite level or at their international presentation level, they can still be Islamic in popular understanding, and they can impact the practice of religion at a fundamental level. So we'll start off with the grassroots. At the grassroots, pious Muslims thought that they were participating in a fight for an Islamic state. But who are these pious Muslims? In Indonesia, they're called santri, and this is a word that was used in Java for students at religious schools. But from the 1920s or 1930s, it began to be applied across the whole archipelago. It's tough to estimate exactly how many Muslims in Indonesia are santri, how many of them are pious, and how many are just called Muslims by the state, or how many of them are sort of Muslims on their identity cards but not practicing. The best way that I have to get a hold of that is the election data from 1955. So here you see all the parties that participated in the 1955 elections, and I've colored in green and then pulled out all of the parties that were Islamic parties. These parties were advocating for an Islamic state, were advocating for the implementation of Islamic law. And so if you add them together, and the largest one is Masyumi, which we'll talk about later, which is a modernist party in its theological orientation. Then NU, which is traditionalist, so it still follows one of the madahib, one of the schools of jurisprudence. They're mostly Shafi'i. And then smaller ones like the Partai Syarikat Islam Indonesia and the Parti. We've got a couple of really quite small parties that were functioning in the regions. Adding all of them up, it's about 45% of the Indonesian population in 1945 voted for Islamic parties. So that's a good estimate, that if you were voting to establish an Islamic state, if you're voting to implement Islamic law, that you're interested in a more pious Indonesia and that you are fairly pious yourself. And so if we imagine that 45% of Indonesians fall into this santri category, then we can think that at least a third of Indonesians, as they participated in the revolution, might have thought that they were advocating an Islamic state, might have hoped for a more Islamic future. And so I want to talk about what the experience was like for them at the grassroots level as they fought. There was a specific sector of these fighters found in most theaters of battle that organized themselves Islamically, that understood the fight in religious terms, and engaged in battle following Islamic tropes from Indonesian society. This certainly was not everyone, and other scholarship has documented communist variants and local thug variants very effectively. But the revolution was a very local and personal experience with few connections across groups and between places, meaning that Santri Muslims could have an insulated experience. This is fundamentally different, I think, from some of the revolutions that we're seeing today in the Arab world, where social media and connectivity allows for a greater shared experience. In Indonesia in the 1940s, you didn't have a way to get messages very far beyond your village. And so if you were told it was an Islamic revolution in your local area, then that's how you would have thought of it. One example of the Islamic experience is the barrage of fatwa that were issued. So fatwas, right, Islamic juridical edicts, started coming out as soon as the revolution was proclaimed. The one you see here is from Aceh, the far northwestern tip. You may remember that's where the tsunami happened in 2004. And it was issued on the 15th of October, 1945. This is actually in Malay, but it's using Arabic characters, which were Arabic script, which was one of the two ways that you could write Indonesian in the 1940s. So in translation it reads, "May all of you, brother Muslims, continue on in the pleasure of God, that is the independence of our country Indonesia. Hopefully all of us will give thanks to God, and may we be close to one another in the closeness of the army of mujahideen, right, Islamic fighters, that enjoys the blessing of the religion of God and raise up the word of God and hold fast to the instructions of Islam." And then it translates, or it inserts, I should say, 4 verses from the Quran that are not translated. They're left in Arabic, so I won't translate them for y'all either. But picking up again in Malay, "It is mandatory for us to join in the fighting of the enemies of God and the enemies of the Prophet, and to follow. Muslims do not follow those infidel colonizers or those who lean towards them and want to recolonize Indonesia. It is mandatory for us to love and be close to God and His Prophet, and may you sacrifice life and wealth to strengthen the religion of God and the legitimate kingdom." So if you imagine yourself in a village in Aceh hearing this proclamation coming to you, probably conveyed to you in a Friday sermon or by your local Islamic cleric, it's understandable that you would think of the Indonesian Revolution as being an Islamic struggle with an Islamic goal. And these fatwas were actually coming fast and furious. This is not an isolated example. It does demonstrate some of the common points. So it says that the struggle was in the way of God. In Indonesian we say perang fi sabilillah. In Arabic you would say jihad fi sabilillah. It was mandatory for Muslims to participate. The goal was creating a state in which Muslims could flourish, or an Islamic state. And major fatwas were issued by large Islamic organizations, such as the Nahdlatul Ulama. They were issued by political parties, such as the Masyumi. And they were issued by conferences of ulama in regional centers throughout the country. In fact, there were so many fatwas coming out that about 2 months into the revolution, the secular government was very embarrassed about it. And the very pious vice president still didn't think it was a good idea to have so many fatwas coming out. So he issued a government regulation that no one was allowed to issue a fatwa that the Indonesian Revolution was an Islamic revolution. Despite that government regulation in November of 1945, they kept coming out. And most of these fatwas would make the fight mandatory for Muslims individually if the Dutch had invaded their province or their territory. So that's Fardul Ayn. or it was collectively mandatory if they were in Indonesia whatsoever, fardul kifaya, right? So you had to maybe send food or you had to send supplies. These fatwas provide insight into the thinking of local Islamic clerics during the revolution. So one important point is that they saw Indonesia's independence as connected intimately with the performance of their religion, believing that Indonesia's freedom and Islam's freedom were mutually dependent. Another telling point is that the fatwas usually predict or prescribe an Islamic state as the form of government that would result from Indonesia's revolution. Local Islamic leaders believed that the independence of Indonesia, a territory with a vast Muslim majority, and they usually interpret it as 95%, although that's probably inaccurate even at that time, would necessarily entail the creation of an Islamic state, the promulgation of Islamic laws, and they also believed that by making an Islamic state, they would earn the blessing of God for the country. Another aspect of the revolution that was likely to imbue it with an Islamic flavor for low-level participants was the leadership role of ulama, of Islamic clerics on the local level. And this was in two sectors, first political and then military. Islamic leaders were at the forefront of both local government organization and local militia fighting. And so in terms of local governments, one of the reasons that this is so important is because during Dutch colonialism, the religious class or the religious scholarly class had been entirely shut out of administration. They could not be a local district head, they couldn't be a local judge, they couldn't be even a government school teacher unless they got a government certification. During the revolution, all of this changed. Local Islamic clerics were incredibly well educated, they were incredibly well connected, they were incredibly well respected, and that allowed them to take positions of leadership in the local government during the revolution. From the statistics that we have, and any revolutionary statistics are very spotty, but in certain patches of Java, we know that upside of 50% of the local government bureaucrats, sort of the what might be a county administrator now or a local governor, were in fact Islamic clerics during the revolution. That number goes up when you move outside of Java, where there were more pious Muslims as a percentage of the population. The lack of central government oversight also meant that a local Islamic leader could strongly influence the character of the administration, the character of the revolution in their territory. So we've seen that in Aceh, we've seen that in South Sulawesi and Central Java, where a local administrator would portray this as an Islamic revolution to the followers or to even the government officials that were working under them. And this is also something to think about in revolutionary times elsewhere. So if we wanted to draw comparisons today with the case of Libya or the case of Yemen, where the revolution sort of proceeded locally, and then you have a local administrator trying to sort of spread their idea of what the revolution was about. I think that has some parallels and perhaps some lessons for us, how we understand the Libyan revolution of 2011, 2012. Ulama leadership was also military, and this is one of the most fascinating roles that Islamic clerics could play. They had ready-made followings in their Islamic schools, so if you have 500 teenage boys who are studying from you, that makes for very easy militia when you see the Dutch coming into the region. It's also traditional at Islamic boarding schools in Indonesia for the sheikh, for the alim, to train the students in local martial arts. So if you're being trained in martial arts, you are very sort of enthusiastic when your alim then asks you to practice those martial arts against supposedly infidel invaders. But Islamic militias were not just based on schools, they were also based in society. There were two very large militias called the Hizbullah and Sabilillah, and those were connected to the Masyumi party. And then there were a lot of very local militias that would have a sort of syncretist flavor. Islamic militias in the revolution had a well-deserved reputation for being fearless. Some of this was perhaps because they believed in the power of amulets, of magical tokens that had been blessed by their sheikh using a spell or using an incantation from the Quran that would then render them impervious to bullets, would render them powerful above their enemies. The Islamic militias were also carefully drilled and prepared in how to follow Muslim regulations. So they absolutely refused to be captured. That was prohibited, and it was widely spread in many of the fatwas that it was prohibited to be captured. You had to die fighting. And this made them usually the first wave of attack when facing the Dutch. Even Muslim women organized themselves to participate in the struggle in religious groups. And so this lovely young woman I met in 2007 in West Sumatra, which is one of the most pious districts in Indonesia. And she was a member of the Sabilillah Muslimat, right, the Women's Front of God, in her hometown of Lima Puluh Koto. And her group established Islamic militias first to support the men's militias, right? So they would set up a local community kitchen. They would provide first aid to the wounded. But by the end of the revolution, when the Dutch had entered her area in large numbers, women also participated in the fighting. And so this woman, her name is Lela Rosma, would participate in the fighting by stunning, she would sort of hide and then would stun the Dutch who were patrolling her neighborhood so that the men could attack them. She did this by mixing sand and chili powder, and she would throw it into the eyes of the Dutch soldiers as they came through on patrol. Some of the militias were more modern, using modern drilling methods or having modern weapons, but many of them remained very traditional, not just through their use of amulets, but also long-standing cultural symbols associated with Southeast Asian Muslims. One of these was wearing white robes, and that had been done in millennial rebellions for at least 2 centuries against the Dutch. Also wearing turbans, oaths of loyalty or determination before they went into battle, or trance-like states, and also the use of Islamic rallying cries for motivation. A very popular one was, "Live nobly or die as martyrs." These cultural symbols suggest why the leadership of Islamic figures was evocative for Indonesian Muslims. Following ulama into battle, or following them in government, both harken back to old tropes of Islamic rebellion, or even millenarianism. Some of the publications that came out in the 1940s during the revolution explicitly invoke those things, that this will lead to a time of blessing and an end times. You see here Perang Sabil or Tuntunan Perang Sabil, the requirements of a holy war. But this goes back, and my esteemed senior colleague at Oxford, Peter Carey, has written about the 1820s and one of the first rebellions against the Dutch. How many of those exact same tropes, white robes, putting on turbans, going into a trance before battle, were deployed by Prince Diponegoro in an Islamically tinted rebellion in the 1820s. I want to turn now to the elite level in the revolution, which has a very different implication. Because at the elite level, sort of basically, it was not an Islamic revolution at the most sort of obvious level. It was a failure. And the failure is a riveting failure. It was a near miss in 1945 to put Islam into the foundation of the state. It was a near miss in 1945 to require Muslims to follow Islamic law, even if you didn't require other citizens. But by 1946, it was clear that Indonesia's formal state structure as a republic would not be an Islamic state. And yet, I firmly believe that the elite level of politics has had a greater lasting impact in Indonesia's practice of Islam, in fact, deepening Indonesia's practice of Islam. And so I want to talk about that because I think that these institutional structures are exceedingly important. So the development of new institutions has had a lasting impact on the life of the country. And the first of these was Masyumi, the Islamic political party. It was established in 1945 in November. And its novelty was sort of twofold. In one way, it was because it was an explicitly political party. It wasn't a mass movement. It wasn't trying to organize orphanages. It wasn't trying to organize Friday prayers. It was a political party trying to do political things. But it was also a pan-Muslim party. So you had people from every theological stream in Indonesia, both those who followed schools of jurisprudence and those who didn't. Conservatives, liberals, all pious Muslims were to participate in Masyumi, the unifying party. Another key innovation of it was the introduction of non-clerical leaders, non-ulama leaders, like the individual you see here named Muhammad Natsir. The peculiar thing about an individual like Muhammad Natsir, and he was actually educated in Dutch schools. He went to a specialist high school, right? This follows the European system where high schools are not general. You do begin to specialize. And instead of becoming a technical expert, an engineer like many of the other leaders of the independence movement, he actually read Greek and Latin for high school, but was a very committed, pious Muslim in his personal life. And was politically a bit of a socialist, actually. He was a member of the movement called the Islamic Socialists. But he was a layperson. He was not a cleric. He was not trained in the Quran. He was not trained in jurisprudence. But he reached the highest leadership of the Masyumi party. One of the reasons that the ulama were not able to dominate the party is because they had been very closely intertwined with the Japanese occupation. They had carried forward the Japanese message and had encouraged Indonesian Muslims not to attack the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. And so there was a lot of worry that if you put clerics at the front of the party, that they would be seen as the old Japanese toadies now running this, and that you wouldn't get Western support. There was also a great concern that in Western-style modern politics, the Islamic scholars wouldn't know how to compete. They wouldn't know how to participate in that system. Whereas the Western-trained lawyers, the Western-trained doctors, the Western-trained sort of modern men, the men who wore pants instead of a sarong, would be better equipped to go into politics. Sorry here, lost my script. Okay. And that's why you have so many Dutch-schooled Muslims who became the leaders of Masyumi. The great impact of, though, has been that moving forward, we've seen lay leadership in Islamic parties up until today. And this is unlike a lot of other Muslim countries, where you will frequently have clerics who try to engage in sort of practical politics. In Indonesia, you have almost no clerics engaging in politics. It's dominated by lay people, laymen, really. In addition to being laymen rather than ulama, there was another strange turn, and this is the turn of the Islamic socialists. And it's both interesting and important, I think. The idea of Islamic socialism sounds somewhat strange today. We think of, after the Cold War, socialism and communism being the enemies of religious groups. But at the time, it was very common to blend socialism with every political stream in Indonesian life. The Islamic socialists were not in control of Masyumi at the party's formation in 1945, but they were very much in control of the party by the end in 1949. And the way that that happened is peculiar. Masyumi as a party never ran the cabinet during the revolution. Instead, the cabinet was run by the Indonesian Socialist Party. And the Indonesian Socialist Party, as they looked to fill out their cabinet, recognized that they needed to have Muslims in it. They recognized that they needed pious Muslims, that they needed representatives from Masyumi. And so the Socialist Party handpicked, sort of plucked out of the lower echelons of the pious Muslim movement, those individuals that they thought were open to socialism. As those individuals were plucked up into the government, Masyumi, as a reaction, put them into the leadership of the party. The party was still new. They had to figure out who should go into the leadership. And so they put in these Islamic socialists into the leadership of the party. And by the end, by 1949, Islamic socialists entirely dominated the board of Masyumi as a party. And for the next 15 years, Islamic politics in Indonesia was basically Islamic socialist politics. The idea that you would spread wealth around, the idea that you would allow certain industries to be owned by the state and nationalize certain key commodities, not usually land, but often oil and gas revenues, sometimes certain export products like rubber. And that's a sort of peculiar way for Islamic socialism as an ideology to rise up, and it's something I don't think people have paid enough attention to. But it speaks to the importance of institutional development. The other sort of key institutional development during the revolution that I think bears noting is the creation of the Ministry of Religion. As I said, the government initially did not want to be an Islamic state, and they limited the role of Islam very acutely. Even in November and December of 1945, 3 months after the foundation of the state, Muslims in the government and outside the government were clamoring for a greater role for Islam in the formal institutions of the state, and the parliament was unwilling to concede that point. But the president, Sukarno, eventually in January of 1946 said, we have to make some concession to Muslims to make sure that they don't abandon the revolution. And so he created the Ministry of Religion at that point. Whereas previously Islamic issues under the colonial regime and then under the Japanese had been split between several colonial offices, the Office of Native Affairs and the Department of Justice and a couple of other places for Hajj administration and for marriages. This new bureaucracy was trying to centralize all of these issues under one institution. So the staff people of the ministry were generally products of traditional Islamic schools, and they were leading members of major Islamic organizations, right? The organizations that would run these Islamic schools or would run Friday prayers or would set up new mosques. And these organizations, in fact, had to wage a bit of a war between themselves to try and dominate government largesse coming out of the ministry. But by the end of the revolution, the Ministry of Religion had sort of carved out a unique jurisdiction. It set up religious courts, Islamic courts. It set up Hajj administration, which was very key. It supported religious education, and it supported both Islamic and Christian education, Catholic and Protestant. But most of its funds were dedicated to Islamic education. And it also produced a lot of religious materials. It governed the importation of Qur'ans, which remains a difficult thing in Indonesia to this day, and the publication of textbooks that would be used in religious schools. It tried a couple of other things. It tried the implementation of Islamic law, and it tried to administer zakat, the Islamic alms that are collected once a year, but those were not generally successful, and they didn't last beyond the revolution. Why do I think that the Ministry of Religion is so important? Well, one of the reasons is because it amplified the voice of Islamic actors within the government. This gives them a seat at the table during cabinet meetings. It gives them a seat at the table whenever they think there's an Islamic policy issue. They can come in and weigh in on the subject. It also creates an office with the capacity to define normativity in religious life. This is something that is sometimes hard to tease out, but in Sunni Islam especially, you don't have a hierarchy of religious authority. It's unlike Catholicism, it's unlike even the Shi'is in Iran. You really have a plurality of voices. And Indonesia traditionally had been very syncretist. There was a lot of mixing of local ideas and local practices with Islamic ideas based on the scriptures and based on the pattern of Arabic practice. And it was very unclear in the first half of the 20th century if Indonesia would become more normative in the Arab sense. There had been a wave of influence from the Middle East, but it had been strongly resisted. The creation of the Ministry of Religion changed all that. It created a place where people, and especially men, trained in traditional Islamic schools, and often those who had received higher educational training in the Middle East, or at least who had become fluent in Arabic and had to engage with texts coming out of the Middle East, had the ability to influence Islamic education, had the ability to influence Islamic discussions. And they did this in a couple of ways. I think the biggest, most important way was through the power of the purse. The Ministry of Religion could support through funding or through direct subsidies, sometimes through subsidies in kind, like the provision of religious textbooks, the functioning of Islamic education throughout the archipelago. And so when you have a funding incentive to be more normative so that you receive a grant or you receive free textbooks from the Ministry of Religion, then you are more likely to bring your school or to bring your teachings in line with Arab-oriented Islamic orthodoxy. And this is something that we should think about even as we look for lessons from Indonesia's Islamic Revolution, because I think the march towards Islamic orthodoxy as internationally understood, Islamic orthodoxy in sort of an Arab scheme, in Indonesia is one of the biggest consequences of the revolution. And I think it's something that we have not seen paralleled in other countries, right? We haven't seen this in Thailand, we haven't seen it in the southern Philippines, because they have not established religious bureaucracies as part of the government for Islam. They've established them in Thailand for Buddhism, but not for Islam. Although I've already gestured in this direction a little bit, it's worth driving home explicitly some of the implications here. I think that these are revolutionary both for Indonesia and that they have the potential to be revolutionary in other Islamic countries. First, the creation of Masyumi and the rise of a new class of leaders creates an opening for laymen in Islamic politics, and they still dominate today. The ulama actually did not accept this change, and there was a big party split in the 1950s when ulama tried to run their own party. That was not entirely successful. But the precedent of lay politicians stood, and to this day, the majority of Islamic politicians in Indonesia are lay people. Second, the creation of a Ministry of Religion allowed for an increased central state control over religious issues. This was exercised through the power of the purse rather than regulation, but Islamic schools, orphanages, publication houses, etc., that wanted funding from the Ministry of Religion had to comply with or at least fall within the range of the ministry's idea of orthodoxy. This led to increasing orthodoxy, but it also led to the marginalization of nonconformist ideas. And one of the things that we've seen in the last 20 years in Indonesia is increasing violence towards those who hold nonconformist ideas, not just the Ahmadis, which is another innovation from outside of Indonesia, but local practices that are not seen as sufficiently orthodox. And that never would have happened before the Indonesian Revolution. This also leads to the increasing power of Islamic organizations as they're able to dominate the Ministry of Religion. Now, I've talked about a revolution on the grassroots level where individuals thought that they were trying to build an Islamic state. and a revolution at the elite level where they were not creating an Islamic state, but they were fundamentally changing Islam and causing revolution in the religion. The difficulty is that both of these revolutions happened at the same time, and that we see throughout the 1940s the two revolutions in conflict. On one side, you have an Islamic experience that's rife with heterodox beliefs and with variant practices, and that flourished in the countryside. That side demanded an Islamic state. On the other side, you have a state that wanted to facilitate the growth of orthodoxy, but did not want to concede an Islamic state. And these seem like contradictory positions, that orthodoxy would not support an Islamic state and heterodoxy would. But this all came to a head in a rebellion that was called Dar al-Islam that was launched in 1949. And here you see two of the remnants of this. On the top, it's an amulet, this one in the form of a red band that you would tie around the front of your head that should make you impervious to bullets. And it's got invocations mostly in Arabic, a little bit in Malay on there. On the bottom, this is actually neither in Indonesian nor in Arabic. This is in Sundanese, which is the local language where Dar al-Islam was launched in 1949. And this is the document that said, "We do not think that the Indonesian Revolution is complete." So as they were hurtling towards recognition by the international community, the national secular leadership of Indonesia was unable to bring the entire population along. And this particular group of Muslims thought that they should break off and try to complete the revolution by establishing an Islamic state. Their rebellion actually lasted for an additional 15 years through 1965. And that sort of points to some of the things that one might worry about in a place like Egypt and a place like Tunisia, where you have a state that's struggling with the question of whether they are secular or whether they are Islamic, whether the revolution had a secular character or an Islamic character. The other long-term legacy of the Dar al-Islam that you see here is that even after the rebellion was finished, the ideas continued. And so a lot of the internationally oriented terrorism that we've seen in Indonesia from 2002 until 2009, the perpetrators of those acts were in fact from families that had been involved in the Dar al-Islam rebellion. The 2002 Bali bombing, which was the largest terrorist attack largest terrorist attack against a Western target after the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. on September the 11th. It was 202 people killed. That was the largest until 2005. All three of the key bombers in 2002 came from Dar al-Islam families. And when their families were interviewed, they said, "We fought for an Islamic state in the 1940s and really believed that's what we were going to get." So that says something about the longevity of these ideas of an Islamic revolution. So as I close, let me just say that I think the experience in Indonesia that I'm calling an Islamic revolution was very different from some other more explicit Islamic revolutions in the last century. One might think of Saudi Arabia in the 1930s as the Saudis actually took over and established the country, Iran in the 1970s, maybe Turkey under the AKP, which is a slow-moving Islamic revolution, right? Trying to Islamize a country that had been so staunchly secular. In Indonesia, the grassroots were moving much faster than the elite level. I think that makes it different than the other Islamic revolutions. However, the lessons about the divergence of the grassroots and national elites and the importance of institutional structures in setting the tone for Islamic politics and about the longevity of Islamic messages, all of these are ideas that we should take away as we continue to seek to understand political upheaval in the Muslim world. So I think I'll end there and turn it over to questions. Thank you all.